Hello, everyone. I'm John Coleman from Apocatastasis, an Institute for the Humanities, an alternative college and high school here on New Milford, Connecticut, USA. This recording is the February 2023 episode of Christian History and Ideas, Season 2. We're going to continue our discussion from December and January about the dynamics of the Second Vatican Council. In particularly, we are going to look at historiography in our time together. Before we recap from January and forge ahead, a few words about ApocatastasisInstitute. We were established on Holy Saturday of the year 2013, and we are an undergraduate college. We have an integrated 3-year course of study where history, literature, languages, philosophy, and such cognate subjects are taught in sync. You will not find any school around that does this. And we also have a whole bevy of individual courses. Additionally, we have intensive courses over a few days, very long days. We cover the bases of a whole semester. And then we also have a monthly subscription model where the student gets one live class per week and one pre-recorded class. It allows you to support the college while at the same time involving yourself more intimately in our day-to-day rhythm. For this recording, I think it's appropriate to bring your attention to our School of Theology. We have a number of fascinating courses, and some of those include Christian history and ideas. So if these topics interest you in a deeper way, we have a private college course that covers these subjects with much more reading and in-class discussion. We also have a look at the Holy Bible, as well as an exploration of liturgy and patristics. So keep an eye on this. We're working on our School of Theology more and more, and as we find out even in these episodes, there's so much to get into. So with that being seen to, we move on now. We happen to be recording this on the 6th of February, 2023, which is the memorial of Saints Paul Miki and companions. And these were various Spanish and Japanese Jesuits and Dominicans and laymen and such who were martyred in the 16th century in the manner depicted here. This looks to be from a church just based on the columns on the sides. I think it's very important and more to the point that we have St. Paul and his friends today. We also have St. Titus on the old calendar, appropriate in both instances because they were missionaries. And we're looking at a dynamic of Christianity in the 20th and yes, the 21st century, where the aspect of culture and the relationship of the church to the existing culture is questioned, is brought into focus. And in particular, that aspect of culture that's chronological, that is to say, the relationship of the church to time. That's our focus now. We're looking at changing times and how does the church, the supernatural institution, how does it handle this? And this is made more complicated, well, because of history. It's made it more complicated in the case of the Western Church or the Catholic Church, because in the 16th century, which is when St. Paul and co were killed, that's not actually why I chose them, because they're in the 16th century. I chose them to bring up here because we have an example of them bringing the gospel into a different culture. Christianity itself is not a European religion, so you have a transplant that itself, 1,000 years later, is being transplanted in the Far East. That's why I have the image up here. But in the 16th century, you have a lot of historical dynamics at play when it comes to the Reformation. And what's appropriate for right now to say is that Roman Catholicism attempts to knuckle down. It attempts to freeze things effectively. Now, whether that was the intention of the Council of Trent or not, that is the result. Historiography is a big dynamic in the Reformation. Obviously, the reformers, their claims were founded on allegedly being better representation of the early church, and especially the primitive church. And so during that time, the institutional church, let's say the Catholic Church, also attempted to flaunt its historical credibility through things like apostolic succession, patristics, and indeed early church practices too. So history always casts a shadow on the present. Anyway, uh, towards the Council of Trent, what you end up having is this ossification, this stonification, this freezing, like in Star Wars, right, with Luke Skywalker in the carbonite or whatever. You have this freezing of Latin Christianity. Now, this isn't the case for the other Catholic churches. It's certainly not the case for the various Orthodox communions, but it is for Rome. And so when you get to the 20th century, as we recap last month's presentation, you have this rapprochement, you have, to use the language of the time, the aggiornamento, you have this updating that needs to take place. And again, as we're looking at this particular subject, it should be said that when I use language like it needs to take place, or I'm using very objective language, what I'm trying to encapsulate, which is very common in history talking, is I'm trying to encapsulate the language of those at the time who were proposing this. So I'm not necessarily advocating or denouncing it. As a historian, it doesn't really matter to me. What matters is what those people did and how they were thinking and what their motivations were. If you suffer through some of my other presentations on this platform and others, you'll know one of my running annoyances is the tendency of people to get caught up in how things ought to be, how they believe things ought to be, which is fine to spend time on, but people get caught up there and they spend so much time thinking about how they would like things to be. They don't actually analyze, one, how things actually are, and two, more importantly, why they are. So that's where we're spending our time in. We're looking in the 20th and 21st century at the churchmen who have the authority, why the decisions are made. And a lot of that is backgrounded by the type of ossification that Trent represents. Now, last month, we looked in particular at the, let's say, the physical production, some of the physical legacy of the Second Vatican Council vis-a-vis the journals Concilium and Communio. And Concilium was, well, let's anchor ourselves. So both Concilium and Communio are products of the Second Vatican Council, of the discussions initiated thereat. They represent two sides of the same coin, not to be cheesy with my similes there, but they represent two interpretations of reformism in the Western Church. And because the Western Church has a legal system or strict law, it's a juristic system, it's not a common law or tribal system, which other communities, civil and whatnot, have known. Because of that, because the Catholic Church in the West and in the East has inherited the Roman law and not the Solic law or the common law, it's a juristic society, and therefore the leaders, whatever they say, it is the policy. It is the policy. In other traditions, other legal traditions, there's a little bit more fungibility of what's actually verbing as opposed to what's intended. But that's beyond our point here. What's on point, though, is that the Second Vatican Council represents a reformist movement that is the policy of the organization. And so you have Concilium, which represents, I think I might have even used this language last month. In pop writing, you tend to say that Concilium was liberal and Communio was conservative, but well worth a discussion all to itself. These are most inappropriate terms to be using for the Church of Christ. These very particular French Revolutionary civil terms that are being applied to a religious congregation. We'll sidestep the famous comment, I think, by an abbot, was it, that the Second Vatican Council represented the French Revolution within the Church. In which case, I suppose the left and right language would be appropriate, but we'll indeed bypass that for the moment and say that the left-right stuff is not quite accurate. Let's delve a little bit deeper. Now, the image here is on the left, I think they say stage left, is Karl Rahner, who was the founder of Concilium. And then in the middle is Josef Ratzinger, who was the founder, or at least one of the founding members, of Communio. In preparing for this talk, I was actually quite surprised to notice his lifelong contribution to that journal from the 70s, the 80s, and then even when he was with the Congregation of the Doctrine of Faith, and then even as Pope, he was popping out various articles and after the fact as well. So this was a lifelong project. I suppose now that the man's gone on to his eternal reward, that the output that he did in Communio, which can be had online, in English no less, for free, will come under more, let's say, more attention by historians and by theologians. And it's all right there. It's quite helpful, I must say. And then I'm afraid I don't know the gentleman on the far right. They all do seem to be enjoying a few jars here, though, in the front. So, who was it? Maybe it was Rahner himself who said that we needed a kneeling theology. Well, maybe maybe in the more Lutheran tradition, you need a drinking theology as well. It should be said, of course, that Rahner and Ratzinger were both Germans. I believe Karl Rahner still on this earth. Let's find out. But Rahner. But in any case, let's try to get a little bit deeper than just the lame liberal conservative junk that pop culture gives us. Oh no, this guy's long dead. Wow. In 1984. Wow. The old man lived to be 80 though. He did all right. Okay. But yeah, let's get beyond on just the froth of the left-right garbage. So can we say that Concilium represented a more sociological understanding of Christianity, whereas Communio represented a more liturgical understanding of Christianity? Before we hash that out too much more, let's just hop into a few words here. And this is the article we had from Church Life Journal last month. So let me say a few words here, and then we'll move towards historiography. Okay, in this, Priswira and Stein are aligned with the creative maneuver of transposition enacted by a host of Catholic thinkers pre-Vatican II in their attempt to overcome the Paleo-Thomism from the early Scheller, Gardini, von Hildebrand, Adams, Rahner, von Balthasar, for German speakers to Blondel, Rousseau, Marcel, Gilson, de Lubac, and the Ressourcement thinkers in France, to Belgian thinkers such as Marshall, Schirrenbeck, Emil Mersch, this is the list of philosophers and theologians, is of course by no means exhaustive. All were of one mind that Catholic philosophy and theology must be rejuvenated, and that the deadlock between modernism and integralism must be broken along with the tradition of Baroque scholasticism in order for Catholic thought to both survive and thrive. And now we move towards the crux of the matter. There has arisen over the past several decades a reading of church development which suffers, as I see it, from an ignorance of historiography and from a real ignorance of the dynamics at play from the 19th century into the 20th century. And so we should right now describe modernism and integralism. So, in a general way, modernism is this idea that, well, here's a kind of a light definition. Modernism, not looking for that. Yeah, so they give me the art stuff here. And that's what I was afraid of. Don't go to Google for a quick definition. Modernism is this idea that doctrines are in, shall we say, dialogue with history. Now, this is going to be very complicated to really understand the profundity of this reality, especially when you consider that Orthodox Christianity has a certain consciousness of how that is, at least during the time of Revelation. At Trent, you have this idea that doctrines are fixed. They're fixed. And then we have to ask ourselves, what happens in the 19th century that would bring on this idea of modernism? Now, this whole discussion of modernism, of course, is muddied quite a bit by St. Pius X and the condemnation of modernism. But it is sufficient now to say that you had this idea of this dialogue of doctrine and indeed a practice, what we call orthodoxy and orthopraxy, with life, with history, with the non-Christian world, shall we say, those without the household of the faith. You had this coming about in a very powerful way because of two things in the 19th century, which get more and more and more powerful. That is the changing sociology of the time, particularly influenced by the rise of the nation state and the Industrial Revolution, mechanization. All of these things change the way people perceive about their own personal lives. They perceive time and space. They perceive their interpersonal relationships, indeed their relationship with God, completely differently. Because of that, you know, I mean, just as a little tiny example, in the 19th century, you have, for the first time in recorded Christian history, liturgies being curtailed for the sake of time. So the 19th century begins to worship time and efficiency. And believe it or not, the first liturgical innovation by a pope is by Blessed Pius IX when it comes to the Epiphany ceremonies, which were believed to be too long. In any case, something else much, much more disturbing for the direct religious consciousness of Western peoples was the suppositions of Charles Darwin, and actually very much overlapping Darwin at the same time, although more in academic circles and literate circles, were the appreciation and the study of higher criticism. This idea that the Holy Bible is not quite the compact text that people had thought it was. Now, in the 20th and 21st centuries, Christianity ends up breasting what seems to be a crisis in the 19th century about that. That is to say, by the 19th century, coming out of the early church, you had this rather, if you'll forgive me, this rather pat understanding of the Bible, very much to be described as a type of scaffolding, right? You did not just read the Bible, but you had a certain scaffolding. And I'm not referring to councils and doctors when it comes to this, but I'm referring to things like, the belief that Moses wrote the Torah, that David wrote the Psalms, that Isaiah is one guy. What higher criticism does in the 19th century is it really challenges, I would say, a lot of the early modern assumptions that tend to ossify some of this scaffolding. So I'm getting a little bit off of the beaten track here, but the point is that higher criticism actually restores a certain sense of nuance into how these texts were compiled. The idea that we'll say Moses had certain students after him, certain schools that were editing the Torah after him. And the same with Isaiah. And how do you figure this out? Well, you figure it out by seeing where the narrative changes, the tone of voice changes, the words used themselves change. And so you come to this conclusion that, well, the Bible itself went through a number of versions and revisions and so forth within the time of Revelation. I'm not talking about church councils and later things. I'm talking within the time period of Revelation, that these stories clearly have been edited and re-edited. And so this lends to a certain in the 19th century, a certain chafing over this scaffolding. And like I say, in later times, this is dealt with. That would be a whole other story. But the shock of sociological changes, the shock of especially Darwinian claims to the self-generation of life, and then to a certain what appears to be a certain attack on the Holy Bible. And initially, you could chop it up that way. Oddly enough, a lot of the higher criticism stuff actually became basically the Catholic approach to the Holy Scriptures, at least to a certain restrained extent, in later time. But at the time, it really was this OK Corral moment between Christianity and the ethos, that scaffolding of the faith, and this new secular world, which appeared to have these conclusions on lockdown, right? Darwinian evolution at a certain point seemed to be adamantine, as it appears in certain areas of our culture today, particularly, oddly enough, in pop memory. The same pop memory that was so shaken by it 150, 60 years ago. And then, like I say, things like higher criticism actually proved to not be the enemy that they might have initially seemed to be, and were adopted to a certain degree. Okay, so that's all modernism. And for the last time, especially Darwinism, this ends up really causing a crisis of faith in people. There's a great author we use at the college here, and that's Will Durant, and he has a fine series called The Story of Civilization. Come on. You try to, be quick on the uptake here with the image search, and it just never cooperates. But there's your Will Durant there, and the wife Ariel did a lot of the writing too. But Will Durant, who actually I think at least twice had enrolled in a Jesuit seminary, and himself had lost faith for most of his life, although I believe he was reconciled to the Roman Church at the end of his life. In any case, at the end of his life, on an interview, I think in 1974, he says that the secularization of Western society was the greatest event the most significant event of the 20th century. And a lot of that had to do with these apparent contradictions between modern knowledge and this received religious knowledge. So all of that is the background to modernism. And then integralism is a massive topic to itself. But integralism, here we go, is well, it's just that. It's this idea that Christian life ought to be integrated into all aspects of society. This would also include the academy. And here you do have a showdown. You do have an absolute showdown at the time. Maybe it's just an apparent showdown, because actually, even in this regard, later Catholicism warmed up to it some. And that is the showdown between secular objectivity, or at least claims to objectivity, and then the worldview. Now, there had been, even going back to the early modern period, I think even in the Renaissance, this idea of two truths, that you could be a professing Christian, and then you could and hold all of the doctrines, and then you could also be scholastic, and you could hold different doctrines. So you could, put in the 19th century, 20th century context, you could on church on Sunday hold to a 6-day creation, and then as a school teacher or something, hold to some Darwinian understanding of it, and that these were both true, but in different manners. That the former could be held in a poetic sense, and then the latter in a a nuts and bolts empirical sense. Well, the integralist does not see that. They would see that as a type of schizophrenia. And so when it comes to academia in particular, and it has certain ramifications in the civil sphere, an idea of the secular nation state and the equality of all communities in the society, and that would mean that the church is, in fact, no different than a married corporation, a married couple, or a library, a Blockbuster Video, whatever. They're all just corporations on an equal plane. Well, you can see there's going to be a necessary confrontation there. And that's some of the background to things like distributism, which was tried in certain, especially Northern European societies, this integration of Catholic economics into the real world. It would, of course, play a role in Spanish politics in the 20th century, Italian, and to a much stranger way, German politics later on, and even in the post-war years. So that's integralism. And this author, getting back to our text, says again, all were of one mind that Catholic philosophy and theology must be rejuvenated, and that the deadlock between modernism and integralism must be broken along with the tradition of Baroque scholasticism, etc. So you have modernism, this consciousness, and now I want to talk about where modernism might have a certain leg to stand on. Again, I'm not advocating this. I'm not advocating integralism, but what I am trying to do in these recordings is I'm trying to apprehend this historical phenomena in the development of the church in the 20th and 21st centuries as soon as yourself. What I am trying to do is understand how and why the participants believed what they did. So this gets us to an understanding of how you could believe that beliefs and practices can change and be updated. Now, part of this is made difficult because of this popular belief that's very much instilled after the Council of Trent, of this type of completely codified Christianity. And a lot of this is made even more inaccurate because of the nature of Catholic education in the West. After the Reformation, and absolutely after the French Revolution, you see, the Roman Catholics in the West really did take on this type of bunker mentality. A lot of this was assisted with a certain ethnic affinity that people naturally have if intelligence agencies aren't trying to deliberately subvert it. And so you could have the neighborhood church, you could have the parish school with an actual neighborhood there. And these are actually, you talk about sociology. I mean, these are things that are quite difficult for someone like myself to imagine an actual neighborhood school, an actual ethnic church, and so forth. So a lot of this insularism, which isn't altogether bad, it is not altogether bad. But the problem with insularity, as we can see very clearly when Spanish-speaking people who have at least a certain amount of fumes from Christian culture, more so than the miserable wasps do. And we can also see this very, very plainly when, for instance, Islamic, we'll say Arab, not that all Muslims are Arab, but where people come from these very old-fashioned societies, very religious societies in the Middle East or Africa, and they come, like the Spanish people, to secular America or secular France or whatever. Very often their children lose the faith. There is something to be said for ethnicity and for insularity. These are huge topics, but the point that I'm getting at here is that there was this perception, part of this perceived deadlock, or this actual deadlock, and it was a deadlock because of certain policies of the Vatican in the early 20th century and so forth, where modernism was branded a heresy. And what that ended up doing, of course, is lumping it, well, what it ended up doing is basically unnecessarily making, or at least painting as enemies, if not making enemies, painting as enemies anyone who had an inclination to contemporary knowledge, or anyone who is sympathetic to the tension between the, let's say, the codified Christianity that was so advocated by Trent in the 16th century and the perceived contradiction of modern knowledge by the 20th century. What the condemnation of St. Pius X did, it not only warned people of, I would agree, wolves in sheep's clothing, and people that in certain seminaries and such that did not have the gospel as their main motive for teaching there. It did have the effect of warning people about real dangers, but it also had the effect of alienating, much like we saw throughout the 19th century. A lot of the intelligentsia who didn't need to be alienated. And oddly enough, this unnecessary schism continues today in certain Catholic circles, let's say. All right, but on what grounds does modernism, and it should be said that both Rahner and Ratzinger in their two journals, getting to January's topic, both represent the modernizing motive of the council. What leg do they have to stand on? And this is where we're getting to historiography, and I really do believe that a lot of Catholics of certain adjectives, which won't be mentioned right now because there's so many and they're so flattering that I can't stomach them. A lot of children of God, let's say, they're not quite getting the historiographical dimension of why the changes in the Catholic Church have happened and are happening. So, on what grounds do the modernist faction, and I'm not using that word pejoratively, what grounds do they stand on? Well, let's speak for a moment about revelation. Let's see, can we get Moses writing? I think that would be a good image here. The reality is, let's see, what do I want? I think this is Rubens or Rembrandt. Okay. But part of this we have to understand is that Christian revelation itself is a product of history. And so we consider that salvation history of the story, not only of the Holy Bible, but in apostolic forms of Christianity, whether that's Catholicism, Orthodoxy, um, so-called Nestorianism, which we've looked at on this program, whether that's the Oriental Orthodox, any Christian community which can trace its lineage back to the apostles. Well, guess what? That salvation history doesn't end with the book of Acts of the Apostles, but continues. And anyone who not just is well-read in church history, but especially in liturgy, will realize that the people of God, to use a Vatican II expression, that their history goes from Adam all the way up to today and up to the Parousia ultimately. And so, keeping our remarks in the realm of revelation, we do have to consider that the Holy Bible is a product of progressive revelation. Now, part of this is made more clear, I should think, because of certain catechetical changes that happened in the 20th century following the council. So again, prior to Vatican II, very, very Tridentine in its approach, right? You have catechisms, you often have memorized catechisms, you have scholasticism, these statements, these very condensed statements that have been filtered through 20 scholars over indeed 20 centuries, and these nuggets of revelation, and they're presented in a certain format. And you have this understanding of the church as the bark of Peter, for instance. And often churchmen and artists and such will, they'll use this because you not only have the connection to Noah's Ark, which we'll be reading in the breviary very shortly, and also in the Missal, prior to the onset of Lent. But you also have the idea of Christ teaching from the boat. So you have the image of the boat, you have the image of the uh, fortress, I suppose, although that's, I suppose, less biblical in its own way. But you have the idea of the insular community that's buffeted by the outside forces. The world, the flesh, and the devil. Well, in the 20th century, and this is, probably a product of the modernists, and it was something actually the Protestant reformers had also grasped onto, is the idea of the covenant. You actually have, I believe, 7 covenants in the Holy Bible, with Adam, with Noah, with David, of course, with Moses. And then ultimately with Christ. You have these 7 contracts that are made between God and different communities, usually the Hebrews, sometimes all of mankind, sometimes with animals and things, such as in the covenants of Noah and Jesus, with all of creation. Actually, with Noah, it's just with the animals, but with Jesus, it's also with the animals, plants, and men, and all creation beyond that. But in any case, in each of these covenants, in each of these revelation points, you have a greater appreciation of who God is, of what's permissible and impermissible, what a life of grace, to use the much later language, looks like. And all of this is in this dialogue, very often dialogue with history, dialogue with invaders, right? So the salvation history is very often influenced by things like the fall of Jerusalem, the Babylonian captivity, the diaspora in Egypt, for instance. And these are elements where the outside world directly changes the course and the believing and the practice of the people of God, both in the Old Testament people of God and that same people of God in the final covenant in the new. And all of this, I would argue, gives the modernists a very strong leg to stand on. And it is a leg which I think a lot of the pious don't quite understand. They're not getting this aspect that Christian doctrine has always been in a state of flux, not in a state of flux in the sense of popular elections or viewership in a film or something completely random, but rather in the Christian consciousness that behind it all is God's providence. Now, I'd like to read just a little bit more here and then conclude this installment and set us up for next month. However, once narrow-minded sawdust Thomism, that's not my language, by the way, was surmounted through a vindication of many thinkers suspected of modernism or neo-modernism by the Aggiornamento of Vatican II, and its opening to the modern world. New problems and questions immediately emerged. It was soon seen that the devil was found in the details of how exactly Catholic philosophy and theology were to open themselves towards and respond to philosophical modernity and modernity as such. Moreover, if the two central questions of the modernist crises can be said to be: one, how were the church and its thought to engage in philosophical modernity? And two, how is one to understand the question of nature and grace, which is fundamentally the division between Rahner and Ratzinger as scholars between concilium and communio. For Rahner, putting this crudely, he focuses, and when I say Rahner, I mean the whole concilium project, focuses on these dynamics of changing sociology. You'll recall from December a colleague of Rahner's, which was Johann Baptist Metz, and his argument. This is a great example of the direction of concilium and where they really saw what ought to be the focus of Christian attention. Remember Metz, he said that we needed a post-bourgeois Christianity, meaning at the time of the Council of Trent and in that whole period to the 20th century, actually, the church had aligned itself, as it has always done, I suppose, with the rising order, when whoever's having the guns and the tax collectors and things. Was it Gibbons who said that the legions, the missionaries followed the legions? Well, in the Tridentine period, the well, actually, quite literally, to dear Paul Miki and his friends, well, the missionaries follow the merchants. Actually, I mean that's not too far off the beaten track. That is to say, the church made an alliance with the bourgeoisie, which was the rising order in modernity. Now, there's a whole aspect that I hope to get into in these months ahead. And this is a very fruitful topic, as you see. But there's a whole aspect of this sociology that's really at play, and I really do think it's a blind area with a lot of otherwise very well-read people. So there's a great example of the snapshot of concilium. Right. So what does Christianity need to do now going into the 21st century, according to Metz and Rahner? You need to sever your connection with the bourgeois, because the bourgeois don't any more than the nobility of days gone by, any more than the Roman Empire. They do not fundamentally have gospel principles. They have things you might be able to work with. You might be able to baptize them, to use the language there, but they are fundamentally a different community than the Church of Christ. And I should want this to be our topic specifically for next month. When I conclude recording, I'm going to write this down and focus us especially on this aspect of how the principles of modernity by the 20th century, certainly the 21st century, are no longer in play. This will lead, as we see nearly before our eyes, to the deposition of the middle class as the ruling class, the removal of them, because fundamentally the middle class no longer believes in its own principles. And that's not a new idea, but that's one that I think is very powerful to where Metz and Rahner and that sociological understanding of moving Catholicism forward into the next eon, where that's coming from. Now, I've laid all of that up. When it comes to someone like Ratzinger and his Communio project, and he was only a founding member of that, as I should say Rahner was with Concilium. These are kind of cliques of theologians. I just have a convenient picture here to kind of encapsulate things. But when it comes to someone like a Communio writer, they would agree with everything I had laid out about progressive revelation. Right? I mean, there was a time in Revelation you could be a polygamist, as the Mormons dearly hold on to, and the Muslims to this day. And then there was a time in Revelation when the married state was the highest state, and in the age of grace, it's actually the virginity state is the highest state of life, right? There was a change there. There's clearly a change over God's self-revelation from the time of Noah to, especially after the fall, to Abraham, to Moses, to David, to Isaiah, to Jeremiah, to Sirach, right? I mean, are you telling me when you read Sirach that this is the precision of understanding of Yahweh, of God, that is presented to the children of Israel? No, right? Because the children of Israel had a revelation, and prior to that, Abraham, right, is a much cruder understanding of God than you get to by the time you get to David and Micah and the minor prophets, and like I say, Sirach and Ecclesiastes and all of that. And my goodness gracious, Jesus, right? You have a huge sublimation of who this Yahweh is. Okay, this is progressive revelation. Rahner and Ratzinger, they both are fundamentally part of this modernizing strain, right? They're going to argue, as Toynbee, there we go, as Toynbee argues in the study of history, you can't stick your feet in the ground and just refuse to move. The traditionalist impulse is the impulse of suicide. It is the impulse of the Eskimo. It is the impulse of the Amish or the Salafi Muslim. You can do it. You can stick your feet in the ground and say, thus far and no farther. And you might survive, which is one of the scenarios of the 23 scenarios of communities confronting history that Toynbee looks into. You can try that, and you might survive, and your community might survive in one sense. It'll exist, but it will no longer be a factor in history. It will no longer be a factor in history. You can almost hear in Toynbee's study of history, when he finally gets to the supposed solution of the conservative, you can almost hear a groan come out of the book, because it's and he never says it's wrong. Like a good historian, he's not there to say things are wrong or right, but for him, and adduced with many evidences from history, when a community decides that it is going to cling to the past, it has made up its mind. They have some revelation, they have some practice, and come hell or high water, they will not change. When that happens, that community may exist, but it ceases to be part of history, much as the Eskimos, much as the Mennonites. Okay. So it's that understanding. It doesn't matter if you believe it or not. What matters is that these guys believe it, and these guys are in control of the church. So as historians, as scholars, we want to get inside their minds. So they both hold that idea of progressive revelation. But here we go. Final point. Ratzinger and his Communio magazine, they see the interaction of God fundamentally, not exclusively, but fundamentally, liturgically. Right? So Rahner sees it, and if you know your books of Kings and Chronicles, you know he's not wrong. He sees the unfolding of providence and the the believing and practicing and ultimate salvation of the people of God as something which is constantly being influenced, ingressed upon even, and jostled by history, by invaders and new languages and diasporas and captivities and liberations, and all of this produces, as we all know from the Holy Bible, right? It produces this drama. It produces this multi-century story, and this story continues into modernity. That's where, your concilium dudes are coming from. Your communio guys are saying that this is liturgical, and that explains why a lot of the strictures and a lot of the codified liturgy is removed in the 20th century. And this is, again, something I think a lot of otherwise very well-read Catholics and very ardent Catholics are not quite getting, is this aspect. And part of this, I imagine, is maybe the church hasn't done a very good job of expressing itself and why these changes happened in the 20th century. Much like my own vocation in academia, oddly enough, these these institutions do a piss poor job of explaining why exactly they exist and why exactly they're doing things. And so necessarily, just like you see in academia, it doesn't explain itself very well to society. So therefore, people, they view certain changes or they view certain directions and things, and innocently enough, they assume, well, they're up to no good, because the people aren't explaining themselves. So it is up to the men of institutions to do a better job of that. So, how did you have this whole traditional sect arise in the past 70 years, 80 years? Because a lot of these dudes were around before the council. How did you have all of this arise? Well, a lot of that has to do with the church not explaining itself. And so in the 60s and 50s, and 70s and whatever, you had all of these changes, this one massive change after another onto a population that were miscatechized into thinking certain things were absolute when they weren't, and could never be changed. And all of this did a real number, and this, putting it very politely, did a real number on the stability of people's faith lives in the midst of huge changes beyond the church in the 20th century, to say nothing of the world wars and dispossessions, economical catastrophes, and so forth. So all of this leads to this well, it's far too soon to say whether Vatican II fizzled out, but the power of the council, I would argue, has not been brought to bear because of this miscommunication and this misunderstanding. And yes, at a certain point, a man has to be a man, and he has to open up a book, and it's not just everyone else's job to explain things to one. So, a lot of the people who are given to griping, well, maybe they should read some Rahner and read some Ratzinger and so forth. Anyway, the final point I did want to make is that just as Rahner sees providence working through history, a la the books of Kings and Chronicles, Communio and Ratzinger, etc., they see this as primarily working through liturgy, which is, again, why you have the loosening up of things, why you have the permission for ad libidinum, as we see in the Breviary and the Missal, right? Ad libidinum practices. You can, it can be little things like you can have different options, or more elbow room altogether. If you actually read, for instance, the general instruction of the Liturgy of the Hours, almost no readings are strictly mandated. There is, for most of the time, most of the year, at least a theoretical possibility of substituting any reading you want. For, you can substitute out this psalm or this collect or whatever. Part of that is this idea, now that the crisis that brought about Trent has clearly run its course, that is to say, Protestantism by the 20th century is a dead thing. it's as irrelevant an aspect of history as the Eskimos or the Amish. Amish themselves a type of Protestant, I suppose. Right now that the crisis has passed, the lockdown can be removed, right? The Tridentine strictness was only there for a crisis called Protestantism. There is no Protestant movement in the 20th century. That there certainly isn't one that's a threat. So you don't stay in a tornado shelter forever. After a while, the tornado moves, and you get on with life. And that's what partially Vatican II is trying to introduce. So the final takeaway here, we're going to continue this discussion into next month. The final takeaway here is that both reformist elements of the council have a perception of history and God's working through history. The concilium ones see it through sociology and literally, civil nation states and living patterns and economic patterns and such. And then your communal sorts see it through primarily the Holy Liturgy. All of this complicated because of history, because we all live in time. There's so much to get into here, and I thank you very, very much for joining me as I help get my thoughts together on this topic. I will not commit to it right now. I have far too many writing projects, but at some point, perhaps, this will be an essay, and in that instance, these presentations will come in very, very handy as my grasp of this massive topic, and I think a topic people have a massive blind spot to, the historiography that churchmen are operating under. Comes into focus. So thank you very much for your time here on this February edition of Christian History and Ideas. Please, if you are interested in these topics, please consider enrolling in ApocatastasisInstitute. We have a full 3-year undergraduate course of study, and we also have all of these amazing standalone classes that you see here. And this is just our theology department. We have a department of science, where we have mathematics and natural science instructors, Doctors Meyer and Spellman. And then we have all sorts of presentations for our School of Arts, our humanities classes. Okay, guys, thank you so much. And if you have any questions, you can contact me at the email below. Masalama.